What happens when a routine parking lot encounter spirals into a national scandal, and the man they tried to humiliate becomes the face of justice? You won't believe how one Navy veteran changed the system, while those who thought they were untouchable faded into obscurity. Frank Caldwell had spent his life earning respect. At 72 years old, he had lived through battles, both overseas and right here at home. He had commanded men, strategized military operations, and made decisions that had real consequences. He had seen the world shift and change, some for the better, some for the worse. And after all of it, after decades of service to his country, he had earned the right to a peaceful evening. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Nothing fancy, just a quick grocery run. A pack of coffee, some bread, maybe a few apples. No drama, no headaches, just him and his 1976 Cadillac Fleetwood, cruising under the dim glow of the streetlights. Now, this car? This wasn't just a vehicle. This was a masterpiece, a machine built with precision, restored with love. Deep, midnight black, chrome so polished it caught reflections like a mirror, and an interior that smelled of fine leather and nostalgia. Every part of it, from the engine to the tiny Cadillac emblem on the hood, had been tuned and restored by Frank himself. It wasn't just a car, it was history, a statement. And tonight, it purred like a lion, smooth and powerful, as he pulled into the grocery store parking lot. But something caught his eye before he even shifted into park. A young man, early 20s, Latino, skinny, wearing an oversized hoodie, was standing by an old, battered sedan, hood popped open. The way he kept turning the key and slamming the steering wheel told Frank everything he needed to know. Car trouble. Frank watched for a second. He could have ignored it, gone about his night. It wasn't his problem, but that wasn't how he was raised. With a quiet sigh, he turned off the engine, grabbed his rag from the dashboard, and stepped out. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint sounds of traffic in the distance. Frank walked over, hands in his pockets, his polished leather shoes tapping softly against the asphalt. "Need a hand, son?" The kid turned sharply, startled. His face was tight with frustration, but the second he saw Frank, something softened. "Oh, yes, sir. The damn thing won't start. I think it's the battery, but I don't know." Frank nodded, stepping closer. "Pop the hood. Let's take a look." The kid obeyed quickly, lifting the hood the rest of the way. Frank leaned in, taking a professional glance at the engine. He had seen this a million times before. Older car, probably hadn't had a good tune-up in years. Nothing a little power boost wouldn't fix. Without a word, he turned back to his Cadillac, popped the trunk, and pulled out a set of jumper cables. The kid's eyes widened. "Man, you keep those in your car?" Frank chuckled, shaking his head. Son, at my age, you learn to stay prepared." The two worked together quickly, cables hooked, engines revved, and after a few good tries, the kid's car sputtered back to life. "Oh, man, it worked. Thank you, sir. Thank you." The relief in the kid's voice was real. He looked like he was one bad night away from a total breakdown, and Frank knew how much a small act of kindness could mean. He wiped his hands on the rag, offering the kid a nod. "That's how it's supposed to be, son. People help each other." The kid grinned, grateful. And for a moment, everything was right. Then came the screech of tires. Loud, sharp, aggressive. Frank didn't even have to turn around to know what it was. A police car. Moving fast. Too fast. Before he could process it, the vehicle skidded to a stop just feet away, cutting across two empty parking spaces. Doors flew open. Boots hit the ground. Hands hovered near belts. Frank stayed still. He had been here before. Two white officers stepped out. Not in a rush, not flustered, calculated, like they already had their minds made up about what they were walking into. The taller one, blonde buzz cut, stocky build, maybe late 30s, pointed straight at Frank. "Hey, you!" Frank didn't move. "What the hell are you doing near this car?" No preamble, no introduction. "No, sir," or "Excuse me." Just immediate suspicion. Frank let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the rag in his hand. This wasn't new. but it still burned. The young man opened his mouth, ready to explain, but Frank already knew. They weren't looking for explanations. They had already decided. They had already chosen the villain in their story. And it wasn't the young Latino kid standing next to the car. It was the black man helping him. Frank had learned a long time ago how to keep his face unreadable. He had stood before commanding officers, before senators, before men who made decisions that shaped the world. He had held his ground in situations where a single wrong word could mean disaster. And yet, none of that mattered here, because these two men, the one standing in front of him, wearing uniforms, gripping their belts like they were waiting for an excuse, had already made up their minds. Black man, nice car. Late at night, must have stolen it. Frank could feel the heat rising in his chest, but his voice remained calm, steady. I was just helping this young man jump his car. The words left his mouth like a simple fact, because that's exactly what they were. But the officers weren't looking for facts. The taller one, broad shoulders and a buzz cut, rolled his tongue over his teeth before speaking, shifting his baton from one hand to the other like he was itching to use it. Hey, let's see some ID, old man. Not sir, not even mister. Frank didn't flinch, but his fingers curled slightly at his sides. He had seen far too many men like this, not just in uniform, but in every corner of life. The type that didn't ask questions because they weren't looking for answers. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket for his wallet. Not too fast, not too slow, because he knew how these moments could turn. 1 second, you're reaching for your wallet. The next, someone's yelling about how they thought you had a weapon. He pulled it out, flipping it open, and held it up for them to take. Before the officer even glanced at it, a voice cut through the tension. Officers, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just... the kid. The young man Frank had just helped, his voice tight with nerves. A rookie mistake. Frank knew better than anyone that when men like this were in control, they didn't like being corrected. And just like that, the cop closest to the kid turned on him with the speed of a coiled snake. Nobody asked you, kid. His voice was sharp, loud, the kind that makes you flinch even when you know you haven't done anything wrong. Then came the shove. Not hard enough to knock him down, but just enough to show who was in charge. The kid stumbled back a step, his mouth snapping shut. Frank's jaw tightened. That was intentional. That was a warning. And now the cop who had demanded Frank's ID snatched it from his hand, barely glancing at the name before speaking again. Open the trunk. The shift was so quick, so smooth that it was almost comical. Frank narrowed his eyes. Why? The officer smiled, but there was no humor in it. Because I said so. You're acting suspicious. There it was, that word. It was never about the car, never about the ID, never about anything but power. Frank crossed his arms over his chest. I don't have to. A simple truth, but truth didn't matter here, because the moment the words left his mouth, the officer's face darkened. The baton stopped spinning in his hand, and then, with zero hesitation, he shoved Frank. Hard enough to send a message, hard enough to let everyone in that parking lot know exactly who was in control. You got a smart mouth, old man. Frank took a slow breath through his nose, his heart steady even as his pulse quickened. This was the moment. The moment where everything could spiral, where words became actions, where a quiet grocery run turned into a nightmare. Frank had seen this look before, that twisted mix of power and amusement, the one that came when a man realized he had total control over someone else's fate. It wasn't about justice. It wasn't about the law. It was about fun. The taller cop, the one with the squared jaw and the cocky stance, started circling Frank's Cadillac Fleetwood like a vulture, dragging his fingers across the glossy black paint, touching it like he owned it. You know what? How about you go ahead and pop this beauty open for us? He shot a grin at his partner, who chuckled under his breath. Frank didn't move, didn't blink. You have no right to search my vehicle without a warrant. His voice was steady, controlled. Because he knew exactly where this was going, the cop's smirk widened, like he was hoping Frank would say that. A warrant? He threw his head back and laughed, loud and exaggerated, as if Frank had just told the funniest joke of the night. And come on, old man. I don't need a warrant if I've got a reasonable suspicion. Frank's fingers curled into his palm. That phrase. It had been used against men like him for decades. Just a couple of fancy words that really meant, I can do whatever I want, and no one's going to stop me. Frank kept his gaze locked on the officer. Reasonable suspicion of what? The cop's grin stretched wider. He tilted his head, tapping his chin like he was deep in thought. Oh, I don't know. Maybe you got something in there you don't want us to see. Something illegal. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Frank's eyes narrowed. They were baiting him, trying to make him slip, to push him into reacting so they could say he was hostile. He exhaled slowly. This car belongs to me. The paperwork is in order, so either charge me with something or I'm leaving. The cop's grin faded. His jaw tightened. He didn't like that. Didn't like that Frank wasn't scared. Didn't like that he was standing his ground. That was when the second officer, the quieter one, the one who had been itching to escalate this since the moment they arrived, pulled out his baton. Frank saw it coming before it happened, saw the way the man squared his stance, the way his grip on the baton shifted, the slight flex in his arm before crack. The sound of shattering glass sliced through the night. Frank's head snapped toward his Cadillac's side mirror, or what was left of it. Gone, nothing but jagged shards where the mirror had been. His stomach clenched. His car, his pride, his work. The cop grinned, spinning the baton lazily in his hand like he had just hit a home run. Oops. Frank felt something hot rise in his chest, but he didn't move, didn't speak, because that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted him to explode. They wanted him to lose his cool, to snap just enough for them to justify what they were about to do next. The taller cop took a step closer, grinning. You like that, old man? Frank's jaw clenched. You're making a mistake, the cop scoffed. Oh, yeah? And what are you going to do about it? Then, before Frank could react, he raised his baton again and swung it straight into the Cadillac's hood. Bang! The dull metallic thud echoed across the parking lot. A deep dent spread across the once pristine surface, destroying years of careful restoration in an instant. Frank felt his pulse thunder in his ears. The cops weren't just flexing their power anymore. They were having fun, and they weren't done yet. The first cop reached into his pocket, pulling out a familiar set of keys. Frank's keys, the ones they had taken without his permission. He dangled them between two fingers, watching Frank's face. You know what's funny? Frank didn't answer. The cop smiled. Then, slowly, deliberately, he dragged the key straight across the side of the Cadillac. Screech. A deep, jagged scar carved into the glossy black paint, stretching from the front fender all the way to the back. The sound of metal scraping against metal sent a shiver down Frank's spine. Not fear, fury. They weren't doing this for any reason other than because they could. Because they wanted to watch him break. Because they thought he was just another black man with no power, no voice, no way to fight back. They thought he was going to stand there, humiliated, and let them get away with it. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Not yet. Frank had been patient. He had stood there, still as stone, watching these two officers tear apart something he had spent years building. He had felt the heat in his chest rise as they scraped his car, shattered his mirror, laughed in his face. But patience had a limit. And these two, they had just crossed it. Enough! His voice cut through the night like a whip, sharp and commanding, honed from decades of leading men into battle. For the first time, the officers actually paused, but only for a second. Then came the laughter. The taller cop, the one with the bad attitude and even worse haircut, smirked and leaned against the dented Cadillac like it was his. Or what, old man? You gonna call your grandma? His partner chuckled, spinning his baton between his fingers. Frank didn't blink, didn't look away. Instead, he took a slow step forward, eyes locked onto the officer. You just committed felony vandalism on private property. His voice was steady, controlled, not raised, not panicked. That was what threw them off. "I'm demanding your badge numbers. Now." A beat of silence. Then another laugh. "Oh, hear that, Mike?" The taller cop nudged his partner. "We got ourselves a lawyer over here." Frank didn't respond. He didn't need to, because while they were playing their little power game, he was already pulling out his phone. The second the screen lit up, the first cop's face dropped. "Put the phone away." Frank hit record. "No." The shorter cop stepped forward, shoulders squared. "I said put it away." Frank didn't even flinch. "I have every right to film this, and I will." For the first time, their amusement started to crack. The second officer took another step, close enough that Frank could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers twitched toward his belt. "Listen, you either put that phone away or I take it from you." That's when Frank smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a weak one. A knowing smile. The kind of smile a man gives when he knows he's already won. "Go ahead." His voice was low, cool, dangerous. "Try it." The officer's foot shifted, just the slightest motion forward. And then it happened. The other cop, the one still holding Frank's ID, the one who had barely paid attention to it before, finally looked at it. Frank saw the exact second it clicked, saw the blood drain from his face, saw his lips part, eyes flicking up from the card to Frank's face like he'd just realized he was standing on a landmine. "Tom." His voice was tight. The first officer frowned. "What?" The second officer. He just stared at the ID, his grip tightening around it, like he didn't want to believe what he was seeing. Then, slowly, he turned the card around and held it up so his partner could see. The taller cop snatched it out of his hand, read the name, and froze. His lips barely moved, but Frank caught the whisper. "Admiral? Caldwell?" Neither of them were laughing anymore. The arrogance, the bravado, the smug little smirks, gone, replaced by something else entirely. Fear. Frank let the silence hang, let them feel it. And then, when the weight of their mistake had fully settled on their shoulders, he finally spoke. "Now that I have your attention..." For a few seconds they just stood there, frozen, like someone had hit the pause button on their arrogance. Frank could see it happen in real time, the slow-motion collapse of their confidence, the blood draining from their faces, the stiffening of their shoulders, the panic flickering in their eyes. Because now they knew. The first cop, Tom, according to his partner, stared at the ID in his hands like it had just turned into a live grenade. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again before he managed to force out the words. You're a U.S. Navy admiral?" His voice had lost its bite. No more bark, no more swagger. Frank didn't react, didn't move. He just watched them. Watched as the weight of their mistake slammed into them like a freight train. He let the silence stretch, heavy and unrelenting, and then finally he spoke. Calm, controlled, lethal. "Too late to start thinking now, boys." The way he said it, slow and deliberate, made both men straighten instinctively, like cadets caught slacking in front of a drill instructor. But Frank wasn't finished. "You just destroyed the personal property of a retired high-ranking officer of the United States military." His words landed like hammers. "That means there's going to be an investigation, a very serious one." The second cop, a little younger, a little paler than before, snapped his head toward Tom, eyes wide. We can fix this, right? It was just a what?" Frank cut him off, stepping forward just enough to make them shift back. "A misunderstanding? A little mistake? That what you're calling it?" The two officers exchanged a look. They were unraveling. Gone was the smug confidence. Gone was the casual cruelty. Now? Now they were scrambling. Tom cleared his throat. Forcing himself upright like that would somehow reset the situation. "Sir, we can..." Frank laughed. A low, knowing chuckle that made both men flinch. "Oh, now it's sir, huh?" The sarcasm hit like a slap. Just minutes ago they were calling him old man. They were mocking him, shoving him, destroying his car like it was a game. But now they realized whose game they were playing. Frank tilted his head, eyes cold. You think this goes away just because you suddenly found your manners? Silence. A flicker of something desperate crossed the younger cop's face. Look, sir, we didn't mean... You didn't mean... Frank let out another short laugh, shaking his head. That's your defense. You didn't mean to harass me. You didn't mean to destroy my property. You didn't mean to treat me like a criminal for simply existing. Neither of them answered, because there was no answer. Nothing they could say would fix this. And they knew it. Frank let them stew in it, let them feel the full weight of what they had done. Because this nightmare, it was only beginning. Panic. Frank could see it creeping in, gnawing at them. The two officers who had been so confident just minutes ago, the same ones who had laughed, mocked, and smashed his car like it was a cheap toy, were now standing there, frozen, stuck. And then desperation hit. One of them, the younger one, the one who still looked like he was searching for an escape route, grabbed his radio with a shaking hand. Chief, we need backup, right now. Frank let out a sharp, amused breath. Backup? Oh, now you need backup? He took a slow step forward, watching as they instinctively stepped back. 5 minutes ago, you were acting like you ran this whole city, thought you could do whatever you wanted. And now? He let his words hang in the air, thick and heavy. The officers didn't answer. Because what could they say? They weren't in charge anymore. They knew it. Frank knew it. And now, the rest of the world was about to know it too. It didn't take long. Less than 3 minutes later, another set of flashing red and blue lights pulled into the parking lot. A second patrol car. But this wasn't just another officer. This was the captain. Frank didn't have to guess. He could tell the moment the man stepped out of the vehicle. Older, late 50s, broad shoulders, hair that had gone mostly gray at the temples, but was still neatly trimmed. A guy who had probably been on the force for decades, and by the look on his face, he was already annoyed. Before he even spoke, he scanned the scene. His eyes flicked from Frank to the two officers standing stiff as statues, then to the Cadillac, its shattered mirror, the deep dents in the hood, the long, deliberate scratch down the side. Frank could almost see the calculation happening behind his eyes. This wasn't just some routine call. Something was very wrong. "What's going on here?" His voice was sharp, direct. And suddenly, the first officer, the one who had been running his mouth the most, wasn't so tough anymore. He practically scrambled over to the captain. His words rushed, jumbled. "Sir, this guy, there was a situation, miscommunication. We thought..." Frank didn't move, didn't interrupt, because he didn't need to, because the captain's face was already shifting. The exact moment he noticed the ID in his officer's hand, the same ID that had turned these two arrogant cops into nervous wrecks. Without a word, he reached out, snatched it, and glanced down. Then everything stopped. The captain's expression changed instantly. The furrowed brow, gone. The irritation in his stance, vanished. Instead, pure, unmistakable realization. He swallowed hard, blinked, then looked back up at Frank like he'd just walked into the biggest mistake of his career. "Admiral Caldwell?" His voice dropped. Not loud anymore, careful. Frank watched him, let the moment settle. Then, in the same calm, unwavering voice, he crossed his arms and said, "Finally, someone who knows how to read." The captain stepped back. Not much, just an inch. But Frank caught it, because he knew what that meant. It meant this man understood something his officers hadn't. It meant he realized exactly how deep of a hole they had just dug for themselves. And now, he had a choice to make. This could go one of two ways. Either he did the right thing, or he went down with the ship. And Frank? He was ready for either. The captain let out a slow breath, his shoulders visibly stiff. Frank had seen that exact expression before. Not on cops, on men who knew they were in trouble, but were still trying to talk their way out of it. "Sir, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding." There it was. That word, Misunderstanding. Like Frank had simply parked in the wrong spot. Like this was some innocent mix-up that could be cleared up with a few handshakes and forced smiles. Frank's fists tightened. His patience gone. A misunderstanding? His voice was steady, but there was no warmth left in it. These officers destroyed my car." His hand motioned towards the Cadillac, the shattered mirror, the massive dent in the hood, the deep gash from the key they had so proudly dragged across the paint. "They shoved me, humiliated me, threatened me." Each sentence hit like a hammer. The captain didn't interrupt, didn't try to deny it, because what could he say? Frank knew what this was, knew that this captain wasn't surprised. He wasn't shocked that his officers had harassed an innocent black man. He was just shocked that this time they picked the wrong one, and now he was scrambling. "Monsieur, let me handle this, sir," the captain tried again, his voice smoother now, like he was calming down a storm. Too late. Frank didn't budge, didn't blink. And then he pulled out his phone, right in front of all of them. No hesitation. The captain's jaw tightened. The two officers visibly tensed, because now Frank wasn't just a problem in the parking lot. He was a problem that could go national. He dialed. It barely rang twice before a firm, authoritative voice answered on the other end. "Frank?" Not Mr. Caldwell, not Admiral Caldwell, just Frank. Like two men who had known each other a long, long time. Frank kept his eyes locked on the captain. "Yeah, Daniel, I need you." Silence. Then the slight shift in tone on the other end. Not confusion, not curiosity, just a simple, weighty, "Tell me what's happening." Frank didn't have to explain who he was talking to, but he did it anyway, because watching the captain's expression shift from damage control to pure panic was something Frank was going to savor. "Daniel, I've got a situation here. Two officers just destroyed my property, physically assaulted me, and now their boss is trying to tell me it's just a misunderstanding." He let those words hang in the air, loud, clear, sharp enough to cut, and then he dropped the final bomb. "Congressman, I need this handled." The captain flinched. The officers, frozen, like someone had just told them the governor himself was about to pull into the parking lot. Because they knew that name. Daniel Carter, U.S. Congressman, Frank Caldwell's longtime friend. And just like that, the power in this situation shifted again. Frank had been patient. Now it was their turn to wait. Because this was just getting started. Frank had seen men panic before. On the battlefield, in high-stakes negotiations, in situations where the weight of their own choices came crashing down on them like an avalanche. But this was different. This wasn't the panic of a soldier facing the unknown. This was the panic of a man realizing he had backed the wrong horse and was about to pay for it. The captain was pacing now. Not striding with confidence, not standing firm, pacing, like a man whose entire career was flashing before his eyes. "Sir, let's handle this quietly." His voice had changed. No more authority, no more control. Now he sounded like a man begging for a lifeline. Frank almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he let his eyes drift past the captain to the two officers standing motionless, pale as ghosts. Not so cocky now, not laughing now, not dragging keys across his Cadillac, or swinging batons like they were invincible. Now, they looked like they were waiting for a judge to hand down a sentence. Frank took his time, let the silence stretch. Then, finally, he tilted his head and spoke, low, even, cutting. You don't want attention?" The captain flinched. Frank stepped forward just slightly, keeping his gaze locked on him. "Where was that concern when your officers were smashing my car? When they were pushing me around like I was nothing? When they thought they could do whatever they wanted because they assumed I was just another powerless old man?" The captain swallowed hard. Frank watched the flicker of something behind his eyes. Regret? Fear? Realization? It didn't matter, because it was too late for that now. "Sir," the captain tried again, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "What do you want, Frank held you his gaze. didn't rush his response, didn't soften his words. "I want justice." And the way he said it, it wasn't a request, it was a promise. 10 minutes. That's all it took. 10 minutes for the flashing police lights to be joined by camera flashes, for the quiet tension in the parking lot to turn into a media frenzy, for the police department's worst nightmare to pull up in a caravan of news vans and microphones. Frank had made the call, and now the world was about to hear exactly what happened. The first reporter jumped out of the van before the engine even fully stopped. A woman, early 40s, blazer slightly wrinkled, moving fast because she knew exactly what this was. A story. A big one. And within seconds, more journalists poured in. Local news, independent media, even a few folks live streaming straight to the internet. Frank had seen enough of these situations to know how they usually went. The police would try to control the narrative, spin it, call it a misunderstanding, bury it under a vague, carefully worded statement that meant absolutely nothing. Not this time. The first camera turned toward Frank, then another, and another, until he was standing in the center of a full-blown press conference right there in the middle of the grocery store parking lot. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask permission, didn't wait for someone else to tell his story. Because he knew exactly how this worked. If he didn't control the story, someone else would. So he stepped forward, voice steady, clear, sharp as steel. "Tonight, I was attacked, not by criminals, not by strangers, but by the very people who are supposed to serve and protect." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The cameras zoomed in. He had their attention. Frank turned, motioning to his Cadillac. The shattered mirror, the deep gash down the side, the dents that hadn't been there an hour ago. "This is what they did. Not because I broke the law, not because I posed a threat, but because I had the audacity to exist in this parking lot, at this hour, with this car." The cameras panned over to the car, captured every detail. This wasn't just a story. It was evidence. And then he did the one thing that guaranteed this moment would never be erased. He pulled out his phone and started recording himself. The second he did, the officers shifted uncomfortably, because now there was no way to contain it, no way to twist it, no way to rewrite the truth, because the truth was live. The first video hit social media within minutes, then another, and another. Within an hour, it was everywhere, trending, blowing up news feeds, spreading so fast that even the police couldn't keep up. By the time the official statement from the department went out, it was already too late. Because this wasn't just a headline anymore. This was a movement, and Frank Caldwell was at the center of it. This isn't just a local issue anymore. The world is watching. The truth is out. And the police? They've lost control of the narrative. Stay tuned, because this fight is just getting started. A few hours. That's all it took. A few hours for the story to explode across the internet, rip through news cycles, and land straight on the desks of people who usually liked to pretend things like this didn't happen. Frank didn't have to look for the headlines. They found him. White cops destroy car of Black Navy veteran without knowing who he was. U.S. Navy Admiral harassed and assaulted by police, caught on camera. Ret Admiral demands justice after racial profiling incident. His phone buzzed nonstop, calls, messages, people he hadn't heard from in years suddenly remembering his number. It wasn't just the news outlets, it was the public. People were furious. Veterans organizations, civil rights groups, politicians. Even the kind that normally stayed quiet when it came to police misconduct. They were all talking about it, because this wasn't just another story. This was undeniable, caught on camera, seen by millions. And now the people who had let this happen had to scramble. Inside the police department, the chief had called an emergency meeting. Every major officer in the department sitting in a boardroom, eyes darting between news clips and social media threads, trying to figure out how to stop the bleeding. They knew what this meant. Public pressure, political pressure, legal pressure. They had two choices: act like they cared or risk losing everything. So they made the easiest call they could. They suspended the officers. Not fired, not arrested, just removed from duty pending investigation. A slap on the wrist, a stall tactic. But Frank? Frank had been playing this game long before they knew his name. He knew what this was. A PR move, a distraction. Something to calm the public down before they could push for something real. And he wasn't about to let them get away with it. So, while they sat in their boardroom, panicking, drafting statements, rehearsing their carefully worded non-apologies, Frank was already moving, because a suspension wasn't enough. A headline wasn't enough. A few angry tweets weren't enough. He wasn't here to make noise. He was here to make change. And this fight? It was just getting started. By the next morning, Frank's name was everywhere. His face was on the news. His story was trending. His phone wouldn't stop ringing, but he ignored most of it, because he knew something most people didn't. Noise doesn't change systems. Lawsuits do. So, when the knock came at his door, he was already expecting it. He opened it to find 3 people in suits, lawyers, not the kind who handled parking tickets, not the kind who played nice, the kind who changed the rules. The woman in front, mid-40s, confident stance, eyes sharp as a blade, stepped forward first. Ooh. Mr. Caldwell, I'm Erica Hayes, civil rights attorney. She extended her hand. Frank shook it, nodding once. She motioned to the men behind her. This is Richard Mills, federal litigation specialist, and Mark Fisher, former JAG prosecutor. Frank leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. So you're the cavalry. Hayes didn't smile. We're the reckoning. She stepped inside, opening her briefcase without missing a beat. Mr. Caldwell, you have an airtight case. Unlawful harassment, destruction of property, violation of civil rights. The footage alone guarantees that this won't just go away. She glanced up at him, voice steady, firm. You have the right to sue the department, and not just for damages. This could lead to a major federal investigation. Frank exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger. He sat down, resting his hands on the table, and nodded. Let's do it. And just like that, the police department's problems went from bad to worse. The internet wasn't just reacting. It was erupting. By now, millions had seen the footage. It had been shared, reshared, analyzed, and broken down frame by frame. The whole world had seen the moment those officers laughed while destroying Frank's car. The way they mocked him, shoved him, treated him like nothing. And then? The way their faces shifted the second they realized who he was. And people were furious. This wasn't just another viral moment. This wasn't just another trending story. This was personal. Because this time the victim wasn't just some faceless name in a news report. This was a veteran. A man who had served his country. A man who had more medals than those officers had years on the force. And now, that same country was watching. And they had something to say. This man put his life on the line for this country, and this is how he gets treated. These officers need to be fired, arrested, and held accountable. Now. If this can happen to a retired admiral, imagine what happens to the average black man who doesn't have connections. It wasn't just social media. The news cycle was on fire. TV stations played the footage on repeat. Frank's name was mentioned in the same breath as other major civil rights cases. Legal analysts debated what kind of charges the officers could face. Morning shows invited retired military officers, all of whom said the same thing. This is unacceptable. This is a disgrace. And yet, the police? Silent. Not a word. No press conference. No official statement. No carefully worded apology. Nothing. Because they knew. They knew there was nothing they could say that wouldn't make things worse. They weren't sorry. They weren't ashamed. They were waiting. Waiting for the news cycle to shift. Waiting for another story to grab the public's attention. Waiting for the outrage to burn out. Because that's how it usually worked, right? A few days of anger, a few hashtags, some petitions. And then, people moved on. The headlines faded. The energy died down. And the people in power, They got away with it. But not this time, not with Frank. Frank wasn't some random name in a news story. Frank had been fighting his whole life, for his country, for his men, for justice. And now, this was his fight. So while the police sat in their offices pretending this would all blow over, Frank was already moving, already making calls, already planning his next move. Because he wasn't just here to make noise. He was here to make change. They thought they could outlast him. The police department had played this game before. They knew the script. They had run this playbook 100 times. Step 1, stall. Step 2, drag it out. Step 3, wait for people to forget. Because that's how it always worked, right? Public outrage had a short shelf life. One viral moment, a few days of noise, maybe a protest or two, and then something else would take over the headlines. Another scandal, another controversy, and the people would move on. But there was one thing they didn't count on. Frank Caldwell. He wasn't some random civilian with no connections. He wasn't some guy who would get tired, frustrated, and give up. He had spent his entire life navigating bureaucracy, military politics, and government red tape. And if the police thought they were dealing with someone who didn't know how the system worked, they had seriously miscalculated. The first delay came fast. The investigation is ongoing. Frank had seen this before. The classic stall tactic, a way to slow things down without making it look like they were ignoring the problem. Then came the statements. Carefully worded, filled with vague corporate-style nonsense meant to sound like accountability without actually saying anything. We take these allegations very seriously. We are conducting a thorough review of the incident. We are committed to ensuring fairness for all parties involved. Fairness? Frank almost laughed when he read that one. Where was the fairness when they smashed his car, shoved him, and treated him like a criminal? Where was the fairness when they mocked him, dragged their keys across his Cadillac, and acted like they were untouchable? No, this wasn't about fairness. This was about buying time. Time for the media cycle to shift. Time for people to stop talking about it. Time for the anger to fade. But Frank was just getting started. While they stalled, he moved. While they delayed, he pressed forward. While they sat in their offices hoping he would just go away, he was making calls. To his lawyers, to veterans organizations, to every journalist, activist, and politician who was paying attention. They wanted the public to forget. Frank made sure they remembered. He didn't just push his case forward. He pushed it higher. Local courts? Too slow. He took it federal. Media attention fading. He made sure it stayed alive. He didn't let the police department control the timeline. He controlled it. And the more he pushed, the more the police department started to sweat. At first, it was subtle. The chief started dodging interviews. The department stopped releasing updates. They were nervous, because now, Frank Caldwell wasn't just a name in the news. Now, he was a force they couldn't contain. And when they finally realized he wasn't going anywhere, they panicked. The police department had a real problem. At first, they thought they were just dealing with one man, a retired veteran, a guy with a damaged car and a legal case. Annoying? Sure. Embarrassing? Definitely. But manageable. They had handled situations like this before. Push back, delay, let the media cycle move on. Except this time? It wasn't just one man anymore. It was a movement. And it was growing. Fast. The first wave came from the activists, civil rights leaders, community organizers, people who had spent years fighting cases just like this. They saw what happened to Frank and knew exactly what it meant. This wasn't just about one incident. This was about a pattern, a system, a reality that Black Americans had been dealing with for generations. So they mobilized. Rallies, protests, legal action. They showed up at police headquarters with cameras rolling. They called for firings, charges, real consequences. And just as the department started to feel the heat, the second wave hit. The veterans. This was where the police really started to panic. Because it was one thing to have activists demanding accountability. It was another thing to have United States military veterans standing right next to them. Veterans groups issued statements. Retired officers, commanders, and generals, people who carried real influence, started speaking out. They didn't hold back. This is unacceptable. A disgrace to the uniform. If they can do this to a man who dedicated his life to serving his country, imagine what they do to civilians every day. They weren't just talking. They were taking action, writing letters to Congress, calling for official investigations, demanding justice, not excuses. The police department was crumbling under the pressure, because now it wasn't just about public outrage, it was about political fallout. And the people demanding answers weren't going to be ignored. The department had thought they could contain this. Now they were just trying to survive it. The real battle begins. At first, the police department tried to stay quiet. The chief refused to take questions. The officers involved were put on administrative leave, a move that fooled absolutely no one. The official statements were vague, carefully worded to avoid blame. We are reviewing the situation. We respect our veterans and the sacrifices they've made. We ask the public for patience while we conduct a full investigation. It was laughable, because the public wasn't patient, and Frank wasn't waiting. Instead of backing down, he doubled down. He gave interviews. He spoke at press conferences. He sat down with every major news outlet and laid out exactly what had happened, without spin, without sugarcoating. They thought they could treat me like nothing. They thought they could break my property, shove me, insult me, and that I'd just take it. They thought I was powerless. They thought wrong. And the more he spoke, the bigger the movement grew. More veterans stepped forward, sharing their own stories of harassment and disrespect. More activists showed up, marching in the streets. More people called for action, not excuses. And behind closed doors, the police department was in full crisis mode. Emails were flying. Phone calls were being made. They knew this wasn't going away. They knew this had spiraled out of their control. They knew they had picked the wrong man to mess with. And now, they were the ones running out of time. It happened faster than anyone expected. The police department was cracking. For weeks, they had tried everything to contain the damage. Deny, delay, distract. They had hoped the public would lose interest. They had hoped Frank would back down. They had hoped the news cycle would move on. But none of that happened, because this wasn't just some internet outrage. This wasn't a moment. It was a movement. And the pressure wasn't letting up. Every protest, every veteran speaking out, every news anchor demanding answers. The police department had one goal: survive. But to do that, they needed to sacrifice someone. And the first to go? The captain. The announcement came late at night. No press conference, no big speech, just a short, cold statement from the department. Effective immediately, Captain Robert Jennings has been relieved of his duties. No thanks for his years of service. No explanation. Just gone. Thrown under the bus, because that's how this game worked. The people at the top didn't care about right or wrong. They cared about optics. They weren't firing him because they suddenly found their conscience. They were firing him to save themselves, hoping that if they sacrificed him, the pressure would stop. But Frank wasn't here for a single resignation. He didn't care about their damage control. This wasn't justice. This was just a start. Because the men who had actually done the damage, the ones who had stood over him, grinning, swinging their batons, they were still walking free. For now. The next hit came 48 hours later. By then, the noise hadn't died down. It had gotten louder. And the police department? They knew they were out of time. So they did the one thing they had hoped to avoid. They named names. 2 officers. The ones who had shoved Frank, smashed his mirror, dented his hood. The ones who had mocked him, dragged their keys across his Cadillac like it was some joke. The ones who had assumed they were untouchable. Not anymore. Because when the department's new statement came out, it wasn't filled with empty words. It was a list of charges: excessive force, destruction of private property. They weren't just being suspended. They were being charged. And suddenly, the men who had been so confident, so sure they were in control, they were standing in front of cameras. But this time they weren't in charge. They weren't smirking. They weren't shoving anyone. They were walking into a courtroom. And Frank? Frank stood outside the courthouse, watching the scene unfold, watching the flashing lights, the reporters shoving microphones in the officers' faces, watching them dodge questions, avoid eye contact, feel the weight of their actions. And then he turned away, because this fight wasn't over, not even close. They had taken the first fall. But Frank? He was just getting started. The police department had lost control. For weeks they had tried every trick in the book. Delay, deny, deflect. They had thrown out excuses, shifted blame, and even sacrificed a few of their own to make it seem like they were handling things. But none of it worked, because Frank hadn't stopped, because the activists hadn't backed down, because the veterans had refused to let it die. And then something happened that changed everything. The governor got involved, not a quiet mention, not a casual acknowledgement, a full-scale intervention. It started with phone calls, backdoor conversations with the mayor, the police chief, and state officials. Calls that weren't suggestions. Calls that made it clear this wasn't going away. Then came the public statement. The governor stood behind a podium, cameras flashing, microphones lined up in front of him. The room was packed with reporters, state officials, and representatives from law enforcement. He looked into the cameras, eyes hard, voice steady. Yidimwiz. What happened to Admiral Frank Caldwell was unacceptable. The room shifted. It was the first time someone with real power had put it into words. No vague statements, no generic "we will investigate" promises. A direct condemnation. And the governor wasn't finished. The people of this state deserve accountability, and they will get it. That was it. That was the moment the game changed. The moment the police department realized there was no more running, no more hiding behind bureaucratic nonsense. Because now, they had no choice but to respond. The department scrambled. They knew what was coming if they didn't act fast. More investigations, more media coverage, more pressure from people they couldn't afford to ignore. So they did the only thing they could do. They apologized, not through a carefully worded press release, not through some low-level spokesperson. They had to do it on camera, for the entire country to see. The chief of police sat stiffly at the press conference table, his jaw tight, his hands clasped together on the table. He didn't want to be there. Everyone knew it. But he had no choice. The cameras were rolling. Every major news network was airing it live. And Frank was watching. From his home, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Because he knew what this was. It wasn't real accountability. It was damage control. But still, he watched. Watched as the chief cleared his throat, shifted uncomfortably, then leaned into the microphone. On behalf of this department, I want to extend an apology to Admiral Caldwell for the treatment he endured. The words tasted bitter in his mouth. It was obvious. But he had to say them. Frank could see it in his face. The frustration. The resentment. This wasn't a man apologizing because he believed what happened was wrong. This was a man apologizing because he had no other option. The chief continued, "This should not have happened." A pause. And then, reluctantly, like it physically pained him to admit it, "We failed." The room was dead silent. The reporters didn't interrupt. The officers standing behind him didn't move, because they all knew. This wasn't about an apology. This was about survival. Because now the department wasn't just fighting bad PR. Now, they were fighting the entire system turning against them. Frank turned off the TV. The apology was over. The chief had said what he was forced to say. But Frank? He didn't smile. Didn't feel satisfied. Because this wasn't justice. It was a performance. And Frank had seen enough performances in his lifetime. The real fight was just beginning. Because what happened to him happened every single day to people without cameras, without connections, without a title to protect them. The only reason this case had blown up was because of who he was. And that fact alone infuriated him. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about every person who had been harassed, disrespected, or brutalized without the world ever knowing. The press conference ended. The police hoped that would be enough, that Frank would take his apology and move on. But they had miscalculated, because Frank wasn't done, not by a long shot. The settlement came faster than anyone expected. The police department had fought hard at first. They had tried to delay, deny, and distract. They had thrown out statements, shuffled around blame, and even sacrificed a few of their own to make it seem like they were taking action. But they had lost. The evidence was too strong, the public pressure was too high, the political cost was too great. So they did what powerful institutions always do when they know they can't win. They threw money at it. A 7-figure settlement, enough to make most people walk away. Enough to make the problem disappear. A check with more zeros than most people would see in their lifetime. For many, it would have been a victory. The kind of settlement that comes with a press conference, a handshake, a carefully worded statement about moving forward. But Frank Caldwell didn't care about money. The thick envelope arrived at his door, hand-delivered by a courier dressed in a crisp suit. The man barely made eye contact as he handed it over, murmuring something about confidentiality agreements and a resolution for all parties involved. Frank took the envelope but didn't open it right away, because he already knew what was inside. A legal document, carefully worded, structured in a way that protected the department more than it compensated him. A deal, a transaction, a way to buy silence. The department was hoping that money would end this, that Frank would take the check, nod politely, and let the story fade away. They had completely miscalculated. Frank sat at his kitchen table, the envelope resting in front of him, untouched. He could still hear the echoes of that night, the sound of a baton cracking against his car, the sneering voices of the officers who thought they were untouchable, the sound of his own pulse, steady and controlled, as he realized they had no idea who they were messing with. Money? Didn't fix that. Money wouldn't fix the shattered mirror on his Cadillac Fleetwood, wouldn't smooth out the deep gashes they had carved into the paint, wouldn't erase the dents they had left in the hood when they treated his car like a playground for their power trip. Money wouldn't erase the humiliation, the sheer disrespect, the way they had treated him like nothing, like he didn't matter, like his years of service, his sacrifices, his very existence meant nothing. And most importantly, money wouldn't stop this from happening again. Because Frank Caldwell wasn't the first man this had happened to. He was just one of the few who had caught them in the act. How many others had been humiliated, beaten, falsely arrested, accused of something they didn't do, simply because they were the wrong color in the wrong place at the wrong time? How many of them had gotten no headlines, no cameras, no justice? How many of them had been forced to take a settlement because they had no other choice? Frank had a choice, and he had already made it. He wasn't fighting for compensation. He was fighting for change, and no amount of money could buy him off. So, while the police department celebrated behind closed doors, thinking they had finally put an end to this nightmare, Frank was already working on the next step, because this fight was far from over. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a reckoning. The officers weren't just suspended. They weren't put on desk duty. They weren't given a second chance. They were done, fired, permanently, stripped of their badges, their power, their protection. They walked into that parking lot, thinking they could do whatever they wanted. Now, they were nothing. Their names were everywhere. No more hiding behind a uniform. No more intimidation. No more getting away with it. For the first time, they were the ones being judged, and it didn't stop there. The shift they never saw coming. The department had no choice. They had spent weeks fighting this, ignoring it, denying it, hoping it would disappear. But the public didn't forget. The activists kept pushing. The veterans stood their ground. The governor stepped in. And suddenly, everything changed. Mandatory body cameras with no off switch, stronger penalties for abusive officers, real terminations, real consequences, independent oversight, not just internal investigations, new leadership, new policies, a new reality. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Frank's victory. The reporters wanted a speech, some big, dramatic moment, but Frank Caldwell, he wasn't here for headlines. He had fought this fight for something bigger than himself. So, when they asked how he felt, he gave them the only answer that mattered. He stood firm, voice steady. "This isn't about me. It's about making sure no one else goes through what I did." And with that, he walked away. Because this fight was won, but the war was far from over. Frank never wanted the spotlight, but when the world knocks on your door, you answer. For weeks, news networks had begged for an interview. He ignored them until now, because this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the truth. When he finally stepped onto the primetime set, cameras zoomed in, the lights brightened, and millions leaned in, waiting. And Frank? He got straight to the point. "What happened to me is not new. The only difference is this time the world saw it." Silence. He continued. "I'm not the first black man harassed by police. I'm not the first veteran disrespected. I'm not the first person whose rights were trampled because someone thought they had unchecked power." His voice was steady, firm. "The real question isn't why this happened to me. The real question is, how many times has this happened with no cameras, no headlines, no justice?" The interviewer didn't interrupt, because this was the truth people tried to ignore. But now, they couldn't. The clip went viral before the interview even ended. Millions watched. Millions shared. Millions finally understood. This wasn't just a headline. It was a wake-up call. And Frank Caldwell had made sure the world heard it. A year had passed. 12 months since that night in the parking lot. 12 months since the world saw what happened. 12 months since Frank Caldwell refused to be another forgotten name. And now, everything was different. The city had changed. Laws had been rewritten. Policies had been overhauled. Police oversight was no longer just a talking point. It was real. Body cameras stayed on. Complaints weren't buried. Officers who abused their power weren't just reassigned. They were removed. For the first time in years, people didn't just hope for justice. They expected it. And at the center of it all, Frank Caldwell, the Wyndham Walls. He had become more than just a man with a story. He was a symbol, a name that meant accountability, strength, change. His words were quoted in speeches. His fight was studied in classrooms. His face was painted on murals in the very neighborhoods that once feared the badge. But what about the officers? The ones who started all of this? The ones who thought they could destroy a man's dignity and walk away laughing? They were gone, fired, forgotten. No one cared where they ended up. No one asked what happened to them, because they weren't the story anymore. Frank was. His legacy had replaced their names. His fight had erased their power. And that was the real victory. Justice hadn't just been served. It had changed the city forever.